And it is a huge welcome to episode 106. And we've got a really interesting show today. Building on from last week's show on wisdom, we're going to travel to another part of the world, really interesting place, and we're going to have a chat with Zen Parry. Zen Parry, as you might have remembered from our earlier episode, was the person who gave me that wonderful advice on dismounting the dead horse and really inspiring me to sort of take on board my own current situation and have the courage to sort of step into a different space. So, why don't we go off and find out what Zen has got to share with us.
It's time for another show from Colin Jones, the reasonable adventurer. Time for you to take another step towards creating your own opportunities for satisfaction.
Fantastic to be able to welcome Zen Parry to the show. Zen, how are you?
I'm really good, Colin. Long time, haven't talked to you in ages.
Absolutely, and you're coming to us all the way from Salish Kootenai College in Montana, which sounds like a beautiful part of the world.
Yeah, it's actually in western Montana. We're close to the Flathead Lake. So if you Google that up, you'll see what an incredible place that is. And we're at the foothills of Glacier National Park. So, and the two tribes are the Salish and the Kootenai. And the third tribe that's involved in this reservation is Pendereel, which is further north.
Well, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that context, but it'd be great if you could help the listeners to sort of get a sense for who you are and where you've come from, because I'm not so sure I've met anyone in the entrepreneurship education space who's travelled into as many diverse contexts globally as you. Can you give us a bit of a recap on where you've been and some of the interesting insights you've had?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. It's I've had two careers, one in the corporate world that was international, and now 10 years in the academic world, and it's equally as international. And the latest count in the passport was more than 23 different countries. And the irony is this appointment in America is the first time I've actually worked in an English-speaking country in this capacity. And through that, especially on the education side, I've been in what's called frontier education environments. For example, in Saudi with the Colleges of Excellence model that was being implemented, and with the American University in Kabul, and other examples as well, where the audience, the students, actually have very unique and amazing cultural heritages that come with them into the classroom. So none of it's mainstream, and it's all situations where education is actually being regarded as an opportunity.
Yeah, that's wonderful, isn't it? An opportunity. Yeah, nice.
Yep.
Yeah, interesting. And what would be, do you think, the challenges? I mean, a lot of us think about challenges that we face in our working lives, in our sort of very Western-oriented universities, a committee that we have to find a way to satisfy, or a political bias that may lean one way or another. How do those things stack up against some of the interesting challenges you've confronted?
Yeah, that's probably the million-dollar question. So in each of these environments, although I'm Australian, I've been confronted with the American version of reality and the American versions of expectations, particularly with education. And when you look into the field of entrepreneurship education, it's even more startling. So about 10 years ago when I got started, I was all souped up with Alex Osterwilder's business model canvas and Steve Blank's stuff and Eric Ries's lean startup terminology, and I thought, I've got the toolkit.
Yep.
And in my first 3 teaching appointments over about almost 4 to 5 years, I was shocked to realise, this stuff actually doesn't work. The students are just sitting here in the classroom punching the clock, checking the box, yep, I've done that elective, I've done that core course, whatever. And it was through that And it was particularly with students from Central Asia, where they are the first generation of in their family to go to college, that were actually taking advantage of these education laws. But I was humbled. I got told how things work in Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan. Later on, it was Afghanistan. And I realised that a lot of what we were assuming is the content to be delivering through these programs is foreign. It just doesn't resonate. So, yeah, that's been the wake-up call for me. And what I've had to do is unlearn everything I thought I knew. And it does work to some extent in a certain context, but in the teaching worlds where I've been in, entrepreneurship or TREP education as we know it with these terms has to be modified. It's not a direct translation, and it might exist in some form, but you've really got to take that time to go and find what that equivalent is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I've always, from the moment I walked into education, have been sort of the moth that keeps flying around the bright flickering light for me is context. It's all about context, and if you can't master the context, then you're always starting from behind, right? Because the transferability of techniques will always be sort of superseded by your ability to adjust and adapt to the different needs of students, and of course the challenges that we face in institutional contexts in trying to meet those student needs, right?
Yeah, I've got to admit, at this tribal college here in the US, the biggest challenge has always been delivering to meet accreditation and curriculum expectations and getting enough content in there so that when the students go back to their reservations, they've got something that makes sense to them in their tribal homelands. The term that we use in the States is Indian country. So when they go back to Indian country, they've at least got minimum one, but usually two versions of these entrepreneurship concepts. One, mainstream, if they want to pursue further and go to MBA school. And the other version is, well, this is what that mainstream tool can look like in your context, and you tell me how it works, and then you help me modify that tool that I can then share with others from your tribe. So that's been the biggest challenge, is these programs that are in these different contexts. It's not like you have a tribal college accreditation process. You don't. You have a regional accreditation process. It's very similar in Australia, very similar standards. And then what you have to do at that tribal context level with your students is figure out, well, here's the term that we have to teach. Now, what's the tribal version? Yeah. And let's have a discussion on what works and what doesn't work.
I'm tempted here. Now, for some of our listeners, you might have remembered that I made reference to Zen's chapter in a forthcoming book that we're putting together, and the title of which is "If You're Riding a Dead Horse, Dismount." And many of these issues here, of course, you discuss in the chapter, which is a really fascinating read. And I think what I most loved about your chapter, beyond the considered focus that you've got on these issues, is at the end of so many paragraphs you're able to tie back in a very, very sort of specific reference to that dead horse, and you've been able to use that metaphor in more than a title, but as a sort of underlying theme throughout, which I think is pretty impressive. In that sense. What I'm going to challenge you to do, and this is really putting you on the spot. I'm a big fan of the process of trying to sort of qualitatively assess scholarship of teaching and learning, and I'm thinking to myself here, why don't we try in real time? Why don't we try and see if you can make sense of the dichotomy that might exist between the tribal world that you can imagine and sense, and the, let's call it the westernized way of thinking about education that you're nevertheless tethered to in terms of the delivery of some of these programs. So Glassick, Huber and Meroff, they have a really nice process of thinking about how would we qualitatively assess somebody's scholarship of teaching and learning. They have 6 specific areas of focus, and I'm going to run through them with you just to get just your general, first off the top of your mind, thoughts on these things. The first one is clear goals. The second is adequate preparation. The third is appropriate methods. Then we've got significant results, effective presentation, which I'll come to in a minute, and then reflective critique. So when you think about the world you're currently in at the moment, how do you see any conflict between the purpose of the program versus perhaps the required purpose to make a difference in those students' lives?
So this is actually, I was a bit nervous when you dropped this on me, but it might actually be easier than I realised. I teach in the experiential framework, and I always have. And coming from industry, I can very comfortably weave in things like work-integrated learning, connections to the next step like an internship. So the content is, the students always know what's in it for them to learn it. But with those 6 points, those are part of what we do with experiential learning anyway, especially the reflection. And the effective presentation, that's a really interesting discussion, because what we teach as professionalism is actually a neoliberal context that doesn't always translate back into tribal contexts readily. But the clear goals and adequate preparation, the way I make all this happen is I give space in my program, in my course, and in my classes for the students to lead the curriculum. So we might say, okay, we're going to look at these 3 concepts, the classic one of customer discovery. So here's how it can look in a mainstream higher education institution, and here are some names, and here's the techniques that are used. Now you tell me what happens when you're on the Wind River Reservation, or you're in Arizona on, the Navajo Nation Reservation. You tell me what happens there, and then you lead those discussions. So those points are actually they happen automatically if you give the voice to that student from that under-resourced population. There's space in that learning experience to bring their opinions. I will add too, what makes this so successful is most of my students, I'd say 95% of them are actually non-traditional. So they're at college, they're already working full-time, they're already going to school full-time, and they're typically single parents. So it's always that balance of daycare and transportation and job, and then school is like number 4. So it's not like you have to, because you're working with that older, more mature student, the adult learning principles apply very, very readily. And one of those key ones that Knowles talks about is, find out what your audience knows. So the first question is always, here's the concept. What does this look like in your tribal context when you go home to Fort Peck or Browning to Blackfeet Nation or to Canada to a First Nation up there? So that's how we look at those 6 points.
So you've got this sort of in situ translation process going on, which sounds pretty neat. So in terms of domain knowledge, how do you find that flow then? Do you find you've got the essence of who Zen is in terms of Zen the educator and, your abilities, but then you're becoming something new as an educator as a result of your ability to respond to and be open to this different tribal context?
Yes, And in fact, I've just submitted some content to a manuscript on that exact point. And I do remember 10 years ago when I first started, and again, I showed up with all these bright, shiny tools thinking, I'm pretty fancy, I've got this figured out. And I was absolutely cut off at the knees in my first semester. And it was because of the comments from these students from these different cultural backgrounds. And that was when I had to stop trying to teach, and I had to just enter that classroom ready to learn. And that was what created that context that made sense back in their home situations, both in Central Asia, and it also works in the tribal context here. Most of these tribal contexts have a societal structure with elders, and the elders are the keepers of the wisdom. So there's usually a lot of learning that goes into that, and I've always seen my role is not to conflict with the elders. There has to be that feeling of simpatico that it's supporting, and my role is to actually help that student get to that better conversation with the elder via education. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I think one of the things that comes out in your chapter really well is this last point of, well, Glassick calls it a reflective critique, but I call it this notion of being an honest witness. I've done a podcast in the past on the challenges of being an honest witness, and so how have you found that in terms of bringing your own humility? Do you think your past experiences of being challenged by different contexts in terms of the limits that you have to work within and what can and can't be challenged, do you think that's prepared you to be open to understanding the tribal necessity in terms of helping to create an educational outcome that has a meaning?
Yeah, so the hardest part of everything I teach is getting that student audience to understand the value of reflection. So I've had to come up with a number of steps to lead them to that point. Walking into a class and presenting some theory like Gill's theory or anything like that and the reasons for doing it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because the use of reflection has a different role in each tribal culture. And it was only when I figured out this has to come through storytelling or it has to come through the voice or the lens of an elder, does it make sense? So I stopped trying to teach, basically. And what I started looking for were similarities in other contexts that the students could relate to. Then you have to give them scaffolding so that they gain confidence because it's such a new thing. It's like, I've got to put my private thoughts down and Zen wants it in a certain way, and I've got to look at what I used to be like, what I'm like now, and how am I going to use this, what's changed with me going forward. And I had to do that myself. I had to look at, well, this is what I thought teaching was all about, and then, quite a few experiences kind of humbled me, and then it was like, well, how is this going to change me? And how it's changed me is, one, I've stopped trying to teach. Two, it's always a focus on creating the dialogue of equality. We sit at the table and we discuss things and we negotiate just like you would in a real-time situation. And then that phrase you use about being honest witness, I have to be that honest witness, just as my students have to be the honest witness to their own growth as they go through these experiences. And what we usually do is, I've got a student startup on campus that is really quite popular and very successful. It's not about the making of money. It's about, can they facilitate events? Can they do certain activities? Can they run certain things on campus? And because of its success, what I keep showing the students is that's you creating that because you've come from this place. And that's all I do in terms of validating the role of honest witness and showing them, you really can do this. This is what it looks like. And then the invitation is to them when they go home to their own reservations is to follow that same process and that same openness to then get those conversations going back in their tribal councils.
Yeah, I want to share with you McIver's original quote on this notion of an honest witness, because McIver is one of my academic and philosophical heroes. His work from 1917 is, it plays a big part of my life. Anyway, he always promised he would never write an autobiography, and he did this one in 1968. But in the introduction, he says, in terms of not wanting to write this, he says, in the courts they swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. They never do. They never can. But without an honest witness, the story would never have been known. And so in your context, I'm curious as to what extent you've been able to tap in to some of the elders and get a sense of what is education from a tribal context. Have you been able to sort of find out from sort of elders in terms of what education is as a process in that context, and think about how you can, adjust what you do?
So there's, I have to take it down a couple of further layers as well. So in Saudi, the concept of education, and it's the perception, good education was often delivered by foreigners. There are some exceptions to that, but generally, if a foreigner was delivering the education, the perception was it was going to be better than Saudi education. And then the role of elders within those societies, being a patriarchal society, you have to, as the teacher, and especially if you're working with girls, you have to work out where's your authority in your voice, and are you mimicking something that they can respond to. In Afghanistan, I worked a lot with Hazara, which are the marginalised minority, and a very different cultural heritage, a very different decision-making mechanism within their society structures. And as a woman, I had a very different role to play because they didn't have that many role models. And I had to be very careful that my white skin wasn't the authority rather than what they were learning through that process. And what I've noticed, it's very similar here. It's not so much that the American education is the be-all to end-all. It is a ticket to a better paying job, and it is perceived as this can open doors for employment. But the reality is when those students go home to their reservations, the elders' word has more authority over a lot of these concepts that they've learned through the education program. And there's a very interesting dynamic because families are incredibly proud when the students graduate from these programs. And my program was that classic undergraduate degree in business. And I could sense that pride that the family had. And at the same time, if you talk to those students 1 and 2 years after graduation and they're back in their at the reservation in their tribal council, when the tribal student gets the undergraduate degree and they go home, and they're working in tribal council and all of tribal politics kick in there, and with nepotism and, questionable practices and favours and a very different kind of ethics and mindset that, doesn't necessarily mesh well with the education this student has. When I've checked in with my students, 1 and 2 years later, the comments are universal. They're all saying, look, I'm ready for a change. I'm leaving. I'm going to move to another city. I'm going to look for perhaps an agency job aligned with my tribal heritage, like Bureau of Indian Affairs. But, the tribal context is not where my education is going to bring much value. And part of that is because these tribal contexts have legacy politics and legacy stories, just like everywhere. Same in Saudi, same in Afghanistan, same in Indonesia as well. So the role of education, yes, it's prized, and it's such a great journey to accomplish, but it doesn't necessarily have that immediate impact when these students return to their home places, which can be a hard expectation to manage. However, if you look at it over a longer time frame, over generations, yes, it's a great thing.
Yep.
But usually people think, okay, I've got this degree, I'm going to get a job. Oh, I can't get a job. It doesn't matter the heritage. That's a universal story. And it's actually compounded with expectations when these students return to their home reservations and they realise no one else necessarily understands the value of what I've got.
Yep.
And that's when the personal expectations, collide with the political expectations and the practices in those environments. But at the end of the day, I'll always advocate for the value of education. And I've often said, sometimes bad education is better than none. The opportunity that is missed, though, in all of these situations is it's not like the business degree is the be-all to end-all and one size doesn't fit all. The piece that's been missed is, can there be more integration of these other knowledge systems? Can there be more embeddedness where research is ceremony, not an assignment? Can there be a better kind of meshing together of the history and the culture and the context that student brings to the classroom and then the learning that's being provided in that classroom while meeting accreditation standards and curriculum?
Well, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, listening to you there, Zen, brings two things to mind. One is, will the education enable people to create opportunities for satisfaction in the reasonable adventurer sense of the world? And then that begs two questions, which is, which world? Would the education enable you to create value in your tribal world? Would it enable you to create value in this other world where the certificate of attainment is a door opener, as opposed to you being able to understand who you are in an authentic way and to be able to sort of, make sense? And so it's a real conundrum, isn't it? Because if you don't have opportunities for economic prosperity in that tribal world, then you may learn about yourself and your understanding, but then what's the value of that? Alternatively, you may learn how to operate in this other world, but in a fairly soulless way, and a bit perhaps not really tethered to a personal rudder, and you may find yourself not really making great decisions, right?
Yeah.
So sort of takes me back to last week's episode, thinking about what is wisdom, and I'll remind you what I said last week in terms of what is wisdom. This is Robinson's definition. He's talking about practical wisdom, and he's saying wisdom locates the prudent course of action and resists the urgings and the passions of the deception of the senses. So he's really saying that the point of education in this sense is to enable someone to know who they are, what challenge they're actually faced with or what opportunity, and therefore how do they understand their own likelihood, their own urgings, whether they're impatient or lazy, whatever, and their ability to be deceived by their own interpretation of that environment. And
so, one of the layers I'd add to that, Colin, is what we find, what I've seen, and other faculty have said this as well, including tribal faculty, is depending on the length of story that student has lived through, and it's always multi-generational, it's not unusual to have tribal students that really don't know a lot about their tribal context and their tribal identity, and they will tell you that. So this is another opportunity, and I saw this in Saudi, and I've seen it in Afghanistan as well. One of the phrases that we use here is walking bear tracks in both worlds, tribal and non-tribal.
Yep.
And that frames a lot of the partnering work I've done. For example, I've partnered with life sciences, so business, entrepreneurship and life sciences. And instead of coming up with a nice fancy thing at the end of it, we had to actually go the other way and really look at, well, what does the student need, a life sciences student need to be entrepreneurially successful in their tribal context when they go home to help their communities. And that's where that phrase, walking bear tracks in both worlds, came up. Was we realised they have to have the standard entrepreneurship tools and techniques and that language which will help them to have conversations off reservation. But we also had to help them identify and then kind of migrate that language into the tribal context so they knew what it would look like. And where we stumbled was knowledge systems, because they're learning about their own knowledge systems, which is how their education works within their tribal context. It's not you go somewhere for 4 years and you get a stamp and that means you know something. It's not that at all. It's about storytelling, and it's iterative, and it's over time. And then the other thing that we bumped into was research as ceremony rather than research as practice.
Yep.
So right there that's where the two paths diverged, and that's when we said, okay, if we can give the student both versions of one concept, either a Western concept, or if they give us a tribal concept and we kind of match it to the Western methodology, then they've got the bear tracks to walk in both worlds.
It sort of taps in quite nicely to the second attribute of the reasonable adventurer, which is developing close friendships in order to develop a sort of a very nuanced appreciation of other people's worldviews. And I can imagine in this context, it's not just a worldview, but also different tribal views, right? Different stories, different interpretations that bring sort of knowledge together in different ways.
Yeah, one of the exercises we did in the entrepreneurship courses was I had, again, 6 different tribes represented in the class, and we picked one story. And for the locals here, it's called the coyote stories, and the coyote can be a trickster or a prankster. He has a number of identities, and each tribal member told the version of that story through their imagery and their context. And it's not always the coyote, but the attributes and the characteristics can actually be very, very similar. And it was just as engaging for them sitting in a classroom learning from each other as it was for me as the non-tribal person in the classroom. And I was fascinated. There was another day we were playing this board game, Rich Man, Poor Man, Cash Flow, and we were doing it as a revision exercise to get ready for some finance courses. And we were sitting there playing and discussing the cards and, should I take this mortgage and should I buy these shares and all this? And there was almost like this secret signal, and all of a sudden everybody in that classroom started talking res slang. Yep. And they're all from different tribes. And it was one of the funniest and most bewildering experiences because they're all different tribes. They've got different versions of reservation slang language, res slang. And they were just communicating. And I thought, if anybody's standing at the door, you will not understand one thing that's being discussed at this table. I'm not sure they did either, but it was that joie de vivre in that moment of that intangible that you can't teach, that actually then became, okay, our relationships are at a new place now. Yep. They had shared that with me. There's no way I could repeat it. And I could laugh from instinct. It's not like I actually understood the words or the languages that were being spoken, because there were different tribal languages. But it was that moment of you trust humanity, and it's like, we're all people. Let's keep this simple. Yeah. And let's come from that point of respect. And that was when the real learning really kicked in. And the real learning came from a foundation of respect.
Yeah, and appreciation. So that's actually, and I think that's a great point for us to close on today, Zen, because I think that it brings back memories, which maybe I'll share in another show, of an experience that I had getting students to engage in a process of deliberate gibberish. But I don't think it rises to the level of that was me asking the students to engage, not the students deciding to spontaneously do it. Which I think would have been so much more special. Zen, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm sure we'll have you come back and report a little bit further on how you've been able to sort of try to find ways to develop these parallel but interrelated pathways for learning. Because I think there's lessons that we can learn from your context and bring across into other contexts, which might not look as historically informed, but nevertheless have the same gaps in them.
Yes, yeah. I think that's the surprising point. But Colin, thank you, because it's a great discussion to have. And again, if you park your title and your robes and your ego at the door and you walk into these worlds, the learning is so rich. And that day when that spontaneous conversation happened is actually one of the highlights that I take very dear stock of in the last 10 years, because it came from a place of trust.
Fantastic. Get back on your horse and ride off into the sunset, Zen.
All right. Thanks, Colin. Thanks for the chat.
Cheers.